Hello, everyone, and welcome. And today I have the amazing historian and author and podcaster and, social blogger. Like, he's so amazing. Adam Pennington. Or if you know him, maybe the Tudor Chess, because on Instagram he's a big thing. When he posts very nice reel, very nice posts, I'm always looking at them and liking them or engaging with them. So thank you, Adam, for being here.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you for the invitation.
And today, I don't know if you know, but Adam also has released an amazing book on the family of the Pauls. And for me, he's just the go-to expert when it comes to the Pauls. And when I went on his podcast, we discussed the fact that in Warful, for example, there were like Margaret Pole, there were Geoffrey, I think it was Geoffrey. That,
Oh, yeah.
yeah, and we were a bit frustrated.
Yes.
But so then I think that first we need to know who were the Pauls and why you decided to write a book about them.
Who were the Poles? Well, it's probably wiser to start by saying they were Plantagenets,
Yes.
because we know them as the Poles because of the convention of women taking their husband's name. I mean, that's simply what it comes down to here. But it is Margaret Pole who is the probably the most well known of the figures of the Pole family, and then her controversial fourth son Reginald Pole, probably the second most well known. But Margaret had a much grander family name, Plantagenet, which obviously is a huge name in the history of England. She was the daughter of George, Duke of Clarence, who was the middle brother of Kings Edward IV and Richard III. So Margaret Pole is although she wasn't ever called Princess Margaret, she was recognised as a princess of the House of York. And so she was raised, in a very, very high status environment. Her father was the second man in the kingdom, and her mother was equally as grand. Her mother was Isabel Neville, the elder of the two daughters of Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, known to history as the Kingmaker, because he was the guy that ultimately helped put Edward IV on the throne. So we're talking about essentially a family who were very, very senior members of the English nobility. And I actually conclude in my book that they probably had the greatest claim to the throne when we look at all of the other noble houses, because the Pole, well, as I say, that they became known as the Poles because Margaret Pole, at the start of the reign of the Tudors, Margaret as a member of one of the greatest White Rose families. When the Tudors came along, that put a real problem. That put a real spotlight on the White Rose network, and the way that the Tudors overcame that was to marry off the senior females from the White Rose families. The most prominent, of course, being Elizabeth of York, who marries Henry VII. But then Margaret Pole is again a very senior female. She's married off relatively into obscurity because Richard Pole, her husband, had a very, very base upbringing. He was not a member of the nobility. He had a very tenuous link to any form of grandeur, which was via his grandfather being a half sibling of Margaret Beaufort. So it was so, to put it into perspective, just how different Margaret's upbringing was compared to what she married. Margaret's father, the Duke of Clarence, had an annual income of roughly £6,000. Margaret's husband had an annual income of £50. So we're talking about this colossal disparity between what she was brought up with to what she married. So yeah, so Margaret and her family Margaret and Richard then had 5 children, 4 boys: Henry, Arthur, Reginald, and Geoffrey, and a daughter, Ursula, who was born third between Arthur and Reginald. So they are a Tudor force of nature. They're a major family. They are, because Margaret is a senior member of Henry VIII's family, ultimately. I mean, his mother was Margaret's first cousin. So she's a prominent courtier, and her life is transformed when Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon marry, because very quickly after becoming king, Henry VIII restores a lot of the lands and titles that were taken from Margaret under the reign of Henry VII, because Margaret's brother, very sadly, was the Edward Earl of Warwick. He entered the Tower at the age of 10 and never left its walls. He was beheaded at the age of 24, very sadly. ultimately, because Catherine of Aragon's parents had made it clear that they wouldn't allow her to travel to England to marry Prince Arthur until senior claimants to the throne had been dealt with. So Edward, Earl of Warwick, was executed. And that then led to all of his lands and titles being reverted to the crown. When Henry VIII came along, Margaret petitioned Henry to have her lands and titles restored. And that's how she became then a major figure at the court, easily the most powerful woman at court, I would say, other than the Queen, obviously. She was certainly the only female, well, she was made a Countess of Salisbury in her own right. And so when we looked at, for example, the top 10 nobles in England, it was 9 men and 1 woman. And that 1 woman was Margaret Pole. So they're basically, in a very long explanation, they are this major family. They're a major figures at court. Why did I choose to write about them? It kind of came to me, really. I wrote a blog article about the Pole family. I was then approached by my publisher to say, would you consider doing a book about them? And I said, sure, why not? So there wasn't really this plan to do it. It sort of came to me, really. But I knew that there'd been a couple of autobiographies. There'd been a couple of biographies about Margaret Pole, but there hadn't been one more also exploring the wider family, and that's what I wanted to do with my book.
Yeah, and I think what you've said is just so interesting as well, because you're right, Margaret Pole is, well, she's Margaret Plantagenet, right? Like,
Yeah.
And it's so, I mean, it's not actually, it's not funny. Henry VII is trying to make her less important by forcing almost a marriage on her with Richard Pole, which she's gonna do. She's gonna, but I feel like there's almost like fate helping her because, as you said, she has 5 children. At the time, it's quite. I mean, the infancy rate is not like great. So like she has 5 children, they become adults, and as you said, the forces of nature. We're gonna dive into them because I want to talk to you about obviously Geoffrey, but also Reginald. And we could talk a little about Ursula because I think she's an interesting figure as well. But one thing is that Margaret Pole, like when you really look at her life, is like so much hardship. She loses her brother, and then Henry VIII is going to, at the beginning at least, show a lot of clemency, like of kindness towards her. Would you agree with that? Like, do you feel like he felt
Totally.
bad for her that she's been treated that way?
Her life was absolutely one of major highs and major lows. Very early on, as a child, her father is famously executed, supposedly by being drowned in a barrel of Malmsey wine. And actually, whilst I think of it, there's a portrait of what is very likely to be Margaret Pole. It shows an elderly lady in the attire of the 1530s. There's what appears to be ermine fur, which is a sign that the sitter is of royal blood. But there's a little clue in that painting that tells us this is probably very likely Margaret Pole. If you look at her right wrist, there is a bracelet, and hanging from that bracelet is a little barrel of wine, a little charm, basically, and that tells us that this is probably Margaret Pole. So her father's executed. Her mother died when she was giving birth to her third child, a second son, who also died at birth. So Margaret's made an orphan very young. She then goes through all of the drama of Richard III's reign, and then when Henry VII comes to the throne, to your point, Margaret and the rest of the White Rose network, females are neutralized. That's what he essentially does. He neutralizes them, and the way that he does that is by marriage. He marries them off. That neutralizes them as threats. When Henry VIII comes along, the single biggest difference really between Henry VII and Henry VIII, at least at the start of Henry VIII's reign, is that he is a king made in the mould of his York grandfather, Edward IV. He looks like him. He's as tall as him. He's said to be very much a sort of a scion of York rather than Tudor in many ways. And because of that, he showed great love for the White Rose network because they were his mother's family, and Henry VIII famously adored his mother. And so at the start of his reign, he really shows a lot of trust and love in Margaret and her family, but the other White Rose families, the Lyles, the Courtenays, the Staffords. And Margaret really benefits from that. She petitions Henry VIII to give her back. Well, she petitions Henry VIII to get her lands back for what she hopes would be for her eldest son, Henry. And Henry VIII says, actually, no, you're going to have this title in your own right. I'm giving it to you directly. That is a singular honour.
Yeah.
I mean, the only other example of it really is Anne Boleyn becoming Marquess of Pembroke, but that was to make her a more palatable marriage prospect, really.
Yeah.
So Margaret, in that respect, is actually pretty unique. But things are always very up and down, and things that
Yeah.
despite having a few years of peace and becoming extremely rich and a massive landowner. I mean, Margaret had lands from Cornwall up to the borders of Scotland. I mean, she was a huge landowner, but she also, she knows that her family's future can be most successfully progressed by marriage. So she starts marrying off her children, her 4 children that can be married. Her son Reginald was entered into the church at a young age, so he was never likely to be married. But her other 3 sons and her daughter Ursula are married off. Margaret finds good marriages for all of them, but probably the most glittering marriage is for her daughter Ursula, because she marries the heir of Edward Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, so Henry Stafford. And this meant that it would have meant that in time, Ursula would have become the Duchess of Buckingham, meaning that she would have outranked her own mother, and she would have been the most senior female member of the nobility after the Queen and any daughters and nieces of the King. That glittering future is destroyed when the Duke of Buckingham falls from favour and is beheaded. So these moments where it all looked like it was going to be glittering are then come to nothing. And that was really the same with Henry Pole's marriage, Arthur Pole's marriage, and to a lesser degree Geoffrey Pole. And Geoffrey Pole is probably the most interesting, I think, of the 5, for various reasons.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you say that, because you see a mother who becomes the matriarch of a family and who becomes who has the favor at first of Henry VIII, as you explained so well. She also became friends with Catherine of Aragon. Am I right with this? Like
Very, very close.
Yeah, and she becomes so. I think that's what creates a downfall. Is that I think her loyalty goes, unfortunately for her. I don't know if you agree with me on that, but like goes to Catherine more than it goes to Henry.
Oh, totally.
And I think that obviously, I think that's where Henry VIII like turned basically against them, the Poles.
Well, that loyalty massively extended to Mary, so Catherine's
Yes.
daughter, because Margaret, in Mary's youth, Margaret was made her governess, so she was a really prominent part of Princess Mary's upbringing. So Margaret and her family are there, on the face of it, loyal to Henry VIII, but really their loyalty lies with Catherine, and in particular the interests of her daughter Mary. Now that also means that they were staunchly opposed to Anne Boleyn and the Reformation. They were religiously very conservative, and therefore, again, outwardly they showed they complied, but inwardly, this was a family who did not want to see the dissolution of the monasteries. They did not want Anne Boleyn on the throne.
Yeah.
And that comes across really clearly right at the very end of Margaret's story, without, spoiler alert, we all know she gets executed. And at her execution, she says prayers for the king, the queen, for the prince, and Lady Mary. She deliberately omits Elizabeth.
Yeah.
So I think that's really telling, actually.
Oh, absolutely. And also, like, for them, it was an outrage, the fact that he wanted to annul his marriage, because we always talk about the divorce, but obviously it's not a divorce. What he was singing was an annulment, right? Like, yeah. I mean, it's not like today when you can get a divorce like this. It's not the right time.
Yeah, people forget
they were staunchly opposed.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I was going to say the distinction people often overlook is that an annulment is essentially it's a cancellation. This was not a thing. A divorce is a mutually agreed, we don't want to be together anymore, let's part. And an annulment is, this was never legitimate anyway.
Yeah, it
let
never
you
happened
forget that
really.
distinction.
Which was such, I think, an insult to Catherine of Aragon, to their marriage, to Mary, like, like, and so I think what you've said is very important to understand the Poles and to understand Margaret Pole. You have to understand, I think, her friendship with Catherine of Aragon,
Hmm.
because, yes, I mean, religiously she was very conservative, but I don't think Henry VIII was that reformist anyway.
No,
And
not really.
I think that it is not about religion really. It's about what on earth are you doing? You are disrespecting your wife. You are disrespecting your country. You're disrespecting your church. You know what I mean? Like, so I think there was like it was when we talk about loyalty, as you explained so well, it was because they were so loyal to Catherine of Aragon and of Lady Mary.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think there was also just that always that undercurrent that they represented the old guard. They knew how things should have been done.
Yeah.
I refer to Margaret in the book as a kind of a living fossil, really, because she's much older than a lot of the members of the court. This is a woman who's literally been there, done it, got the T-shirt. You know, she
Yeah.
would have remembered Edward the Fourth. She would have remembered Richard the Third. So she's a living dinosaur, I suppose, at the court of Henry VIII. And
Just find it funny. Yeah. You're totally right. I totally agree with you. I just
you
love
know,
it that
so,
you.
but so I think because of that, it's the affront to the change of religion, it's the affront to Catherine and the interests of Mary, and it's also just the what the fuck are you doing? Like this is not how it works. You know,
Yes.
you are a king is the first among equals. You know, is how they would have initially seen it,
Yeah.
and so the fact that he becomes all powerful to them is it's an anathema. You know, they're like this is not how it works.
Yeah.
So there was just I think really it wasn't it was loyalties and then it was just they their very being was a ready-made affront as well to the Tudors. That's I think the other thing we always have to keep in mind about them and the wider White Rose network. They are a ready-made affront to the Tudors because many of them had far superior claims to the throne than the Tudors did. That's something we always have to keep in mind. The Tudors had no business being on the throne of England at all.
Yeah.
And of any of the claimants, it's my belief that the Poles were probably the strongest.
Yeah. Yeah. And I see. I would see why you would think that way, but how they would themselves see themselves that way. Just I mean, like.
Hmm.
So let's now dive into it because, like, so the two sons I really want to discuss now are Geoffrey and Reginald. So how did they play a role in Tudor history? Let's put it that way in general.
Mm. Reginald is easily the most consequential. He was actually the reason he entered into the church was a cost-saving exercise on his mum's part, on Margaret's part, in their youth. You know, in the window that Henry VII is on the throne, Margaret is all but destitute because her husband dies quite unexpectedly. The meager amount of money he was bringing in then immediately dries up. It's not there anymore. And Margaret is forced into sanctuary, taking sanctuary as a means of having a roof over her and her children's heads and having food in their belly. But even that, you know, there were still measures that had to be taken to try and alleviate some of the strain. And Reginald was one of those measures. So he enters into the church at the age of just 6 and is raised in the church and becomes, well, by the end of his life, he's a cardinal. He goes in his teens, he goes to Italy, to Padua and to Rome, where his education is actually sponsored by Henry VIII. So Henry VIII evidently showed quite a lot of aspirations for Reginald, for his cousin Reginald. And so he goes out to Italy. He, whilst he's there, is the window that Henry VIII is attempting to marry Anne Boleyn. The Great Matter is sort of smack bang at the same time that Reginald is in Italy. And whilst he's there, the Pole men back in England, particularly Henry Pole, who's the heir, are doing what they can to support the king and get the marriage to Anne Boleyn through. And Reginald, being in Italy, Henry VIII looks to him to try and gain support from the Italians. And Reginald shows all the signs of being willing to do that, and that he's going to prepare some paperwork. He's going to get back to England to really show his support. That letter, or more accurately, book, eventually arrives after Anne Boleyn has been executed. So it's years later, and it's not a particularly warm letter or book. It's quite the opposite. It's known as De Unitate, and it's a blistering attack on Henry VIII. He refers to him as a Nero. He likens him to Caligula. He tells him that he's destroyed the best men in the kingdom, and that is referring to Thomas More and John Fisher. So it's just it explodes. You know, it's a very explosive statement, and that immediately then puts a huge spotlight on the Pole family, and that is when really the wheels come off and things start to go very badly wrong.
But
Geoffrey,
it's brave, isn't it? It's very brave that he did that.
it's very brave, but I would also
It's very
say
stupid.
very stupid, very, and we would now call it selfish. I mean, his family are left picking up the pieces. This is a different time, though. You know, I'm one of those. I'm a historian who firmly believes in not psychoanalyzing people from 500 years ago, because they weren't like us. You know, they were different. Had Reginald not done what he did, then he wouldn't have been Reginald Pole. He was who he was, and to him, his family's safety, I suppose, was compromised. Well, for him, you know, he had a wider. He believed that, you know, the king needed to be told this, whether it affected his family or not. So it's a really difficult one. It was, yes, brave, but also really stupid, because it does cause massive issues for his family back at home. He's safely ensconced in Rome under the protection of the Pope. You know, and as much as Henry VIII sent assassins to try and get to him, they never managed it.
Yeah.
Geoffrey Pole is the youngest of the 5 siblings, and because of that, he suffers in a way that lots of other spare heirs suffer, namely that he doesn't have much money.
Yeah.
It's a common trait that second or third sons have to endure. Catherine Howard's father, you know, for example, Edmund Howard, was famously always really poor, and Geoffrey Pole is the same. He's got constant debts, and it's not helped by the fact that him and his wife. The other thing about the Pole family that makes them, I suppose, dangerous to Henry VIII is that they also maintain the Plantagenet ability to have loads of children. Ursula and her husband have 14. Geoffrey has 12. And of Ursula's 14, 12 reached adulthood. You know, and the majority of Geoffrey's did too. But he's got this massive family. He's got very little money, so he starts racking up a lot of debt, and that then leads to problems for Geoffrey. And
Yeah.
so that's really where, again, it's Geoffrey and Reginald that are the problem poles, as it were.
Yeah. And so we had the TV show, like the second series of Warfall in BBC, which is going to be in the State, I think, in March on
March,
PBS,
yeah.
I think. But so we had a few scenes, I think 2 with Reginald Pole and just 1 with Margaret Pole, and like, if I'm
Geoffrey
correct, I
Pole.
think it's something like that. But there's lots of mention about Reginald, like in that. And what I love is like what you're saying about the book that arrived. You know, they portrayed that well in the show when Henry is like, you know, I think he's furious. He's just like, oh my God, I can't believe he's my cousin and what he's writing about me. You know, how dare, you know, and everything you mentioned, the fact that Henry VIII funded him, like you have really that it's the fury of Henry VIII, like how dare you after everything I did for you, for your mother. And but you have a representation of the Pole, like very briefly of Margaret Pole. You have one scene, really. And we
Yeah.
discussed that and we thought, what on earth are you doing?
Yeah, I just found that so bizarre that she was in it for literally 2. I mean, it's Dame Harriet Walter. When they're casting a dame, you know, you imagine, well, they're going to. She was on screen as much as the actress who played her in season 1, Janet Renfrey.
Yeah.
I don't understand why they bothered to include her. Really, it didn't.
Yeah.
You know, and there were 2 scenes with Geoffrey, only one with Margaret. But it's my only complaint really of Warfall is that
Wow.
it was too tried to pack too much in, and rather than, I think unless you understand the story behind the polls and the
Exactly.
Exeter conspiracy, people are going to be watching that going, why is
He was,
Geoffrey in
yeah,
prison? Why
yeah.
has he tried to commit suicide? None of that is explained in the show.
No, no. And can you explain that to us? And
Yeah, yeah.
actually, can you explain to us like how it actually? Well, can you answer the question? Do you think, as an expert on this family, um, do you think that somehow they played a role, directly or indirectly, in the fall of Cromwell,
No,
downfall of Cromwell?
other way around. He absolutely was involved in their downfall. I don't believe they were involved in his.
Okay,
For the
okay,
simple fact that they were, by the time he goes to the Tower, Henry Pole has been executed, Margaret Pole is in prison, and Geoffrey Pole is a broken man. So it's the
okay,
opposite. He's very involved in their downfall.
okay,
Um, but they were by no means friends. The Pole family and Cromwell were not close, for similar reasons to Cromwell not being close to most people. They were the old guard. They saw him as a jumped up oik. They saw
like
him in the same way that the Duke of Howard sees him.
yeah,
Sorry, the Duke of Norfolk, I mean. Um, so in that respect, they're not close. They deliberately try to make the dissolution of the monasteries and the Reformation. They try to make it more challenging for Cromwell. He knows that by getting them out of the way, that life is going to be easier for him when it comes to things like the dissolution of the monasteries. Because the thing that people always have to keep in mind is just how powerful the nobility were in the everyday life of the areas of which they held land.
yeah,
Margaret Pole, as I've mentioned, had land from Cornwall up to Scotland, but it was mostly concentrated around the southwest, so sort of starting in Hampshire and going through to Somerset and so on. And a real indication of just how powerful Margaret was from a local perspective. And actually, I think in some ways her control touched the dictatorial in one way, namely that it becomes clear that she was basically forcing some of her churchmen to reveal things that had been said in confession, and that is a rule that you shouldn't that you know someone shouldn't break.
yeah,
And the inference there was that they were looking for people within her lands that were of the reformist leaning. And so in that respect, she is causing issues for Cromwell. So it's a good way of getting a very prominent family out of the way. It's yeah, I would say it's very much he's involved in their downfall, not the other way around.
yeah. But I do think that I think what was missing in the show, and I don't know if you, because I see what you're saying, but the fact that he took them down also explains his personality, as you said,
Mhm.
like, and also like the fact that we don't discuss how they were treated. And when I say under Cromwell's rule, you know what I mean, like
Mm.
the fact, and I think that we just dismiss the fact that we they almost try to remove like the bad stuff he really, like it was just Anne Boleyn, what he did to Anne Boleyn, but then we remove that. It's not just that. It's
Yeah.
not just that. And obviously Henry VIII is the one who's also very much behind it. I mean, I don't believe that Henry VIII is a puppet king. I think he's very much in charge. You see how he turns on, against Cromwell
Mhm.
himself. You know what I mean? Like so. But I think that was a piece, as you explained so well, that was missing because he did um, bring them to their downfall, and as you said, like I said, Reginald was brave. I think you shrewdly noticed that actually maybe not, like in a way he created also the downfall of his family. and
Yeah.
and and I have a question for you. Do you think he resented his family for sending him away when he was a kid? Because there's all this story about how he was really upset that his mother gave him, when I say gave him away to the church.
Mm. I don't know whether I would say he resented it. but I would say that it compromised his loyalties. And I suppose by extension of that, had he remained in the bosom of his family, had he stayed in England, he would have been more acutely aware of the dangers and therefore probably wouldn't have done what he did.
Okay.
So do I think it was resent? Not necessarily, but I think he would have definitely turned out differently had he stayed in England.
Yeah.
I think the actually, had Reginald Pole not done what he did, I think that it's entirely possible that the whole Exeter conspiracy wouldn't have been a thing. And
Mhm.
that, and in particular, I think had Reginald been captured or apologised, that it might have ended up saving his mother's life. I
Okay.
think that's also possible. But yeah, the Exeter conspiracy is. Would you like me to explain a bit about that?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes, that'd be great.
So it's called the Exeter conspiracy because the most senior person involved in the scandal and that would lose their life was Henry Courtenay, Marquess of Exeter, who
Yeah.
was another cousin of the king. And at its crux, it is purely a conspiracy. There is no irrefutable proof that these families looked to overthrow Henry VIII, but that is what the basis of the conspiracy is. That the White Rose families, so the Exeters, the Poles, the Nevilles, and the Carews, sort of were clubbing together to overthrow the king. Now, as I said, it's my belief that had Reginald not published De Unitate, that could have been something that just didn't happen at the Exeter conspiracy. It was a series of things that, because Henry couldn't get to Reginald, that's when he turns on his family.
Yeah.
And Geoffrey's debts then really start to bite him because he basically he opens up a communication channel with Reginald via a servant of his called Hugh Holland. And that immediately is treasonous because Henry VIII had made it clear that Reginald was now a traitor and that there should not be any communication between his family and Reginald because, assassins were being sent to try and bring
Yeah.
Reginald to be judged, to be arrested, I should say. But Geoffrey Pole opens up a line of communication to him. He then starts releasing information to Reginald that can have only come from the Privy Council. We learn that is via the Marquess of Exeter.
Yeah.
Marquess of Exeter and Henry Pole are really close, and they ultimately, conversations between friends and relatives, offhand comments, things like, Geoffrey Pole says that he hopes to see a merry world one day, and Henry Pole mentions that none rule about the king but knaves, and that the world is coming to stripes. Now, exactly what he means by the world coming to stripes is a difficult one, but it's my belief that it is referring to, because even then, stripes were a sign of what were being worn by prisoners.
Yeah.
So it's my belief that quote was him sort of saying, under the current reign, evil men, criminals are reigning supreme.
Yeah.
Now, that is just talk. That is not plotting. That isn't bringing an army together. But what we have to keep in mind is that talk mentioning a time without the king, any sort of change to his policy massively lands on the 1534 updated Treasons Act. And this is what we always have to keep in mind, is that, yes, it was just talk, it was banter, but that crossed a line. It's the reason why Anne Boleyn is ultimately technically guilty of treason because of the dead men's shoes quote. If we believe she said it, then she is technically guilty of treason. And that's the
In
same
that
with
act, under that act, right?
in
But
that
like
specific
that's
act.
where it's mental. Like that's where
Yeah,
I
it's
think
not
that
the sleeping with other men, which we know she didn't. But it's
no,
that's actually
yeah,
the bit that technically
absolutely,
she's guilty of. And
absolutely,
so that's the same with the Pole boys, really. It was offhand comments that were then twisted against them, and the belief was that if her sons had been doing it, then Margaret was privy to it, And that's what then leads to this big series of arrests. There are 13 arrests in total and 9 executions.
That's insane.
When you look at the evidence, really, I would say that Reginald is guilty of treason. He is. He was trying to provide aid to the Pilgrimage of Grace. And if Henry Pole said the things that it's claimed he said, then that he did cross a line. Now, does that justify their executions? Of course not. But we must keep in mind that there is more to this
Yeah.
story than Henry VIII purely going a bit bananas and beheading an old lady. There's a lot more to the story, actually.
And can you just explain? So to end this amazing interview, I have to say, you obviously know that you're a very good storyteller, but like the way you've explained everything, thank you so much, Adam. I'm sure my audience is thinking the same. It's just so clear. But I would like you to just explain what basically happened to Geoffrey, Margaret, and obviously Reginald, because Reginald survives.
Yeah, he's the great survivor is Ursula, actually, and that's
obviously,
yeah, because
but as someone who really stole lots of shit.
Well, I actually say in my book that Geoffrey Pole being pardoned is probably the biggest surprise that Henry VIII ever made. I mean, this is a man who, so in the end, as I said, there were 13 arrests, 9 executions. 3 of the executed are 2 are churchmen and 1 was Hugh Holland, the servant. Being baseborn, they are hung, drawn, and quartered. You then have the noblemen that are beheaded, so that's Henry Pole, so Margaret's firstborn, the Marks of Exeter, Sir Nicholas Carew, and Sir Edward Neville are all beheaded. Margaret is eventually arrested. She's initially under house arrest. She's then conveyed to the Tower of London. And unusually, she's imprisoned for a long time. Where normally they were beheaded the condemned were beheaded within a couple of days. I mean, George Boleyn was beheaded just 2 days after his trial. Margaret spends 2.5 years in the Tower of London, a really, really long time. And she's joined in there by her grandson, so Henry Pole the Younger, so Henry Pole, Baron Montague's son. And it's a really sad story about him because he just vanishes inside the Tower of London. And I refer to him as the third prince in the tower because this is a boy who did have royal blood and he just vanished. We don't know what happened to him. He entered the tower at the age of 10 and we don't know what happened. So Margaret's in the tower. She's there for 2.5 years. And like Thomas More, she's in increasingly worse state. She's not being sent fresh clothing. She's not being fed a lot. And this actually got back to Catherine Howard. And because by this point, Catherine Howard is married to the king. And she sends Margaret some furred nightgowns and some new slippers and things. And I think that's it shows us that Catherine Howard was caring and actually had enough sort of, strength to say to Henry, I'd like to, I feel bad for this lady. I'd like to send her some items. And he would have had to have approved that. But Margaret is then eventually executed as well. Henry VIII and Catherine Howard go off on a northern progress. And before departing, Henry says, right, let's clear the tower out of all remaining prisoners. So then Margaret is visited in her chambers and told, today's the day you're going to be beheaded, you're going to be executed within the hour. And Margaret's execution has gone down as one of the most sort of infamous for its bungled nature. Now, there is a legend that Margaret ran around a scaffold being literally hacked apart, and I'm pleased to say that is very, very unlikely. The report of that came a long time after and just doesn't make a lot of sense. Margaret, despite her imprisonment, she was an old member of the nobility. She knew how things worked. She wouldn't have been running around a scaffold being hacked apart. Moreover, she was nearly 70, and having been in prison for 2 years, she wouldn't have been in the best health.
Yeah.
And moreover, all of the other accounts mention that the execution was so rushed that there wasn't even a scaffold, and that the block was it was almost like a log. There wasn't even a proper block. So she had to lie down. She couldn't even kneel. She had to physically lie down. And the regular executioner had gone north with the king. So a youth is brought forward, given an axe to do the job. And it's really badly botched. It takes several blows to kill her. But yeah, the story about her running around a scaffold is likely made up. There are only about 150 people present to see the execution. As I mentioned earlier on, she gives a speech where she commends the King and the Queen, Prince Edward and the Lady Mary, deliberately omitting Elizabeth, which I think, as I said earlier, very, very telling. Geoffrey Pole gets pardoned, and he attempts suicide in the Tower of London because he was one of the people that, well, he was the one that gave the most evidence against his brother, against the Marquis of Exeter. This leads to him attempting suicide twice, actually. The first time he stabbed himself and it didn't work, and the second time he tried to smother himself. And I think that my conclusion is that he will have been deemed either insane, or the amount of evidence he provided basically granted him a reprieve, and he's released from the Tower of London, a very broken, very, very broken man. But it's one of the most surprising decisions Henry VIII takes, because this man there is more surety that he was guilty of treason than the vast majority of the people that Henry VIII executed. Reginald continues to live in Italy right up until Mary I comes onto the throne. And that is the point at which he can safely return to England.
Yeah, it's the rise of Reginald Pole, almost.
Massively.
Yeah.
It's he would have not been welcome under Edward, but Mary very much so. And he returns as almost like a conquering hero. I mean, he rides into London ahead of 2,000 men on horseback. He's this, it's like a real returning moment. And he becomes, I think, the most important man in Mary's life, actually. More important than her husband, certainly more. And I would also say he was probably the most loyal man in her life. And poignantly, they die on the same day.
I know.
Yeah, he dies just 8 hours after
It's
her.
so good for Elizabeth. I'm sorry to that. So good for her that he died on the same day, because it would have been such a bloody pain.
Yeah.
And he was Archbishop of Canterbury. He would not. I don't see him he would have never accepted to crown her. It would have been so she's so lucky. I always say this.
Yeah. Well, was Gardner still around at that point? He wasn't he? When Elizabeth.
I need to double check that.
I cannot stand Stephen Gardner. He's I don't know the man, but I cannot stand Stephen Gardner. I won't even do an episode about him on my podcast because I don't want to give him the oxygen of publicity, even though he's been dead. Even though he's been dead for 500 years. Yeah. So Ursula, as I said, was the great survivor, really. She lives quietly up in Staffordshire in the Midlands with her husband. They have 14 children, 7 boys, 7 girls. And her daughter Dorothy goes on to be a major figure at the court of Elizabeth I. And actually the irony of all of this is that the people that, so Ursula's children, so Dorothy and her family, they become Protestants and they flee England during the reign of Mary I. They return with Elizabeth. So it's kind of the irony that Margaret Pole was so devoted to Mary, but her granddaughter and her family and the rest of her grandchildren end up siding with Elizabeth in the end.
Well, you have to work with your time. You have to work with the politics of your time.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
It's so brilliant.
And they, I mean, what's also quite touching is that there is a monument in Westminster Abbey to Dorothy. It was installed by Dorothy's son, and it mentions her lineage, and it's the only burial of a member of the Pole family that has had the ability to commemorate their lineage, because all of the other ones, Geoffrey, Reginald, Margaret, Henry, are either executed or buried semi in disgrace. So it's kind of it's a sweet irony, really, that the least consequential figure, Ursula, produces the individual with the scope to commemorate the Pole family. That's, I think, quite touching, really.
It really, really is. And could you please just end of this, why in the end, when we think about why was Margaret executed?
Why was she executed is actually a really difficult question.
Like
Because,
it is, isn't it? Like it's like
yeah,
why would he pardon Joffrey but execute Margaret? Like it for me, it's almost a mystery. It's a
it
mystery.
is a bit of a mystery. And to this day, I still cannot land on exact, and I don't think, save fresh evidence coming out, I don't know if we'll ever know exactly why he made that decision. I think it was driven by spite. He was,
Yeah,
was it? It was a really big sign to Reginald Pole, that you are still massively out of favour. I'm going to do the cruelest thing I can do. I'm
yeah,
going to execute your mother. I think
yeah,
that's part of it.
yeah,
I mean, the thing that actually the the piece of evidence very much, inverted commas, that leads to Margaret's execution, what leads to her guilty verdict, is a piece of cloth that's discovered 6 months after she's first being interrogated. They discover this altar cloth that shows the pansy, which is the Pole family sigil, and the Tudor rose being sort of intertwined. And the suggestion was that this was to show that Reginald would eventually marry Mary.
yeah, yeah. And that she supported it. Like
Yeah.
yes, yes.
Now, it's entirely possible that this was just a perfectly innocent piece of cloth showing the link between the two families. It's also entirely possible that it was made by Cromwell. We
And
know that Cromwell is not above creating fake evidence, because the problem for Margaret's the men asking Margaret all of the questions, they could get nothing from her. She was so unbelievably measured in her answers, and she gave a real, for me, I believe she firmly spoke the truth throughout her interrogations, because she says things that could be controversial. She says things that it would have been easier not to say, but she says them anyway, which to me suggests that she was speaking the truth. For example, they ask her, did she burn letters? And she said, yes, I did. And it would be easy, and the
so
inference is,
no.
if you're burning letters, you're burning evidence. But the fact that she says, yes, I burnt letters, to me, that tells me that she is being totally truthful, and that
Mm,
she's not like, it would have been an easier thing to say, no, I haven't burnt letters. What do you mean? And they ask her,
yeah.
when assassins were sent to get Reginald and they failed, they ask her, are you pleased that Reginald survived? And she said, of course I'm pleased he survived. I'm
Oh
his
yeah.
mother,
Yeah.
despite the fact that she'd also said that he was no son to her anymore because of the way he'd spoken about the king. But again, it comes back to this thing of her saying something that was controversial. It would have been easier for her to say,
Just lie or
yeah,
yeah.
to lie, but she
Yeah.
didn't. So I think what kills her is, I think it's spite, actually,
Yeah.
when it comes down to it.
I'm so glad you said that because it's my theory as well. I think like he really wants to get to he wants to destroy everything that Reginald has in England, which is basically his family,
Yeah,
because it's the only control he has, right? It's
yeah,
the
we
only
can't get
thing
to him.
control he has. He has nothing else over
Yeah,
him.
and that's
And
why I believe, had he got him, Margaret would have survived.
yeah, yeah, I think so too. I think so too.
Because
Oh,
Gertrude
Adam, it was
Courtenay, sorry, because to add on to that, is that Gertrude Courtenay is pardoned, so that she's the wife of Henry Courtenay, Marquis of Exeter,
yeah,
and there is so much more evidence against Gertrude Courtenay than there was Margaret.
yeah,
But Margaret is executed, Gertrude is pardoned.
that's insane.
What leads me to the conclusion there is that Margaret was a Plantagenet, Gertrude married one. So there's that immediately, there is the difference there. But the fact that Gertrude is pardoned, I think, tells us that Henry VIII was not above pardoning people tied to this. He pardons Geoffrey. And I think he would have pardoned Margaret had Reginald capitulated, but he didn't. So, yeah.
Yeah. Adam, I cannot tell you how amazing this was. I
Oh,
mean,
thank you.
so guys, if you haven't had your hands on Adam's book, you know what to do. And
Yes, go to
obviously,
Amazon.
and obviously you have new plans as well. I mean, keep an eye on, like, watch out what Adam is going to do next, because he has lots of plans and there's lots of things in the pipe work. And I cannot wait to have you again and to
Very
discuss
welcome.
more things. It was so lovely. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure.